The winter of 1864 had descended on Blackwood, Massachusetts, with severity that seemed almost deliberate, as if the season itself were determined to test the endurance of every soul who called a small town home. Weeks of relentless storms had left the streets buried under layers of snow, the once familiar cobblestones hidden beneath a crust of white so thick that wagon wheels often froze in place and had to be pried loose with iron tools. The wind moved through the bare limbs of the great elms that lined the town square, threading its way between the buildings and howling like some nameless spirit determined to remind the townsfolk of their vulnerability. Even the gas lamps that marked the main thoroughfare offered little reassurance. Their glass panes, fogged by frost, dimly refracted the weak halos of light that spilled to the swirling flakes, barely illuminating the narrow paths beaten down by the boots of those who dared to venture out. Inside parlors and kitchens, families huddled close to stoves and fireplaces. The crackle of burning was their only defense against the cold that pressed at the walls and seeped through every chink and gap in the boarding. The storm had a way of shrinking the world, forcing people inward both physically and in spirit. It was in this cold-locked, tightly bound season that Dr. James Thornfield's life was interrupted by a case unlike any he had ever seen. Dr. Thornfield had been in Blackwood for 5 years, long enough to be both accepted and gently set apart. He was a man of modern science in a town still clinging to a patchwork of old beliefs and practical traditions. His journey to Blackwood had begun in the lecture halls of Harvard Medical School, where he had been part of the first generation of physicians trained in the use of microscopic analysis, a discipline still regarded with suspicion by some of his peers. The Civil War was in its 4th brutal year, but the fighting felt far away here in northern Massachusetts. Many of Thornfield's classmates had gone south to serve as surgeons on the battlefield. He, however, had been denied such a calling. A limp, the lingering legacy of childhood polio, made him unfit for the rigors of military service. Though the rejection had stung, he had chosen to channel his knowledge into quieter work, treating the ailments of a small community, documenting his findings, and pushing the boundaries of understanding when circumstances allowed. His office, a modest addition to his home on Elm Street, was both workspace and sanctuary. The pride of the room was a gleaming brass Zeiss microscope, purchased at considerable expense from a German craftsman in Boston. It sat at the center of his mahogany desk, its polished surfaces reflecting the amber glow of lamplight. In an age when many still spoke of imbalances of humors and divine punishments as causes for illness, the microscope represented something different: progress, precision, and a belief that the unseen world of cells and fibers could yield answers to the mysteries of disease. At 34, Thornfield was unmarried, though not without offers in his earlier years. Medicine had claimed most of his attention, and any thoughts of marriage had been further postponed after his arrival in Blackwood, where the work of tending to the sick was endless in winter. His housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, a widow of calm demeanor and precise habits, ran his home with an efficiency that bordered on the invisible. His shirts were always pressed, his meals hot at the appointed hours, and his medical supplies meticulously ordered. So well, in fact, that Thornfield sometimes suspected she knew his inventory better than he did. The townspeople respected him, though some of the older residents still favored the herbal cures of Mrs. Wilkins, the midwife who had served Blackwood for more than 40 years. Thornfield didn't begrudge them that. Trust was not something earned by a diploma alone. It was built over long winters, when a doctor's visits were as much about reassurance as they were about remedies. Most of his winter cases were routine: chilblains, frostbite, fevers that responded to poultices and rest, the occasional broken bone from a slip on the ice. These he recorded in neat, careful script in his leather-bound journals, each case accompanied by precise notes on symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. The morning of January 12th began as so many had that season, with the muted light of snow pressing against the windows and the faint hum of wind moving down the chimney. Outside, the storm had grown worse overnight, turning the streets into long, uneven corridors of white. Drifts leaned heavily against doorways and windowsills, and the air was so thick with falling snow that the neighboring houses across the street were reduced to pale, wavering shapes. Inside, Thornfield stoked the coal stove in his office, the sudden bloom of heat spreading through the room and thawing the cold stiffness from his fingers. He had just settled with his morning cup of Darjeeling when it came, a sudden, urgent pounding at the door. The brass knocker rarely sounded with such insistence. Thornfield rose at once, the cup rattling faintly as he set it aside. Crossing the narrow hall, he paused at the frosted glass to wipe away a circle with his handkerchief. Through the blur of snow, he made out the dark shape of a carriage, its paint dulled by frost, the edges rounded by snow already beginning to cling. The two horses stood with their heads bowed against the wind, their sides rising and falling in great, steaming breaths. A driver, bundled in heavy wool and a beaver fur hat, was descending from a bench to assist a second man. This man was taller, wrapped in a dark greatcoat whose collar was pulled high, but even at a distance Thornfield could see that the coat and the man's dark hair were powdered in white. Between them they carried something, a bundle tightly wrapped in blankets, that the taller man held as if it were more precious than anything else in the world. As they reached the gate, the wind caught the taller man's hat and sent it tumbling down the street in a rush of white. He didn't glance after it, only tightened his hold on the bundle. When he called out, his voice was nearly swallowed by the wind. "Doctor, please, you must help us." Thornfield didn't hesitate. He pulled open the door, and the storm's cold fingers reached in at once, biting at his face and hands. He stepped aside to usher them in, the driver following with the snow still clinging to his shoulders. The taller man's expression, now visible in the lamplight, was that of someone who had been traveling in desperation. Handsome features drawn tight, eyes shadowed with worry. His boots left wet prints across the polished floor as he crossed the room and set the bundle carefully on the examination table. "What has happened?" Thornfield demanded, already sweeping aside the papers and correspondence that cluttered the table. The man's voice trembled. "My daughter, Evelyn, she will not wake." The man, Edward Marsh, hovered over the table as if the mere act of stepping away might endanger the small figure wrapped within the layers of blankets. Snow melted from the folds of his greatcoat, puddling on the polished wooden floor, the damp spreading slowly toward the legs of the table. In the lamplight, Thornfield could see that beneath the travel grime and wind-burned cheeks, Marsh was a sort who had once been accustomed to comfort. The fine weave of his coat, the discreet but costly gleam of a gold signet ring, the careful grooming that even a storm could not wholly undo. Yet all those markers of status had been eclipsed by the strain in his features, the furrowed brow, the desperate tightness around the mouth of a man who had not slept in some time. With deliberate care, Marsh began unwrapping the bundle. The blankets, heavy with snow and damp from melted ice, fell away one by one until the shape of a girl emerged, a girl so still she might have been mistaken for a wax figure. She was small for her age, perhaps 13, her limbs slight beneath a nightgown of fine cotton trimmed with embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Long auburn hair lay across the pillow of blankets, the strands clinging faintly from the moisture in the air. Her skin was pale, not with the warm pallor of sleep, but with a stillness that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was her lips that gave Thornfield pause first. They were tinged with an odd bluish cast, not quite the cyanosis he had seen in cases of oxygen deprivation, but something subtler and harder to name. Leaning close, he studied her chest, noting that her breathing was so shallow it could not be discerned at a glance. He pulled a small mirror from his desk drawer and held it before her nostrils. A faint film of condensation appeared, enough to confirm life, though barely. "Has she been ill recently?" Thornfield asked without looking up, already reaching for his stethoscope. Marsh's reply was taut, as if the words themselves cost him something. "She's never been robust. My wife died giving birth to her, and from the first days, Evelyn has been fragile, susceptible to fainting spells, to exhaustion from the smallest exertion. The doctors in Boston have examined her many times, but none could name the cause." He hesitated, watching as Thornfield adjusted the stethoscope in his ears. "We were on our way to consult a specialist in New York. The storm caught us here." Thornfield pressed the diaphragm to the girl's chest, listening. The heartbeat was present but alarmingly slow, irregular in a way that reminded him of a clock that had not been wound properly and was now ticking unevenly toward its stop. He made a note of it in his mind, but kept his expression neutral. "You say she was well enough yesterday?" "She was quieter than usual last night," Marsh admitted, "but not alarmingly so. This morning her governess went to wake her for breakfast. It was then we found her like this, cold to the touch, barely breathing. Cold. Thornfield's hands had already told him as much. As he laid his palm briefly against her cheek, the temperature shocked him. Not the sharp, biting cold of exposure to the elements, but something deeper, as though the chill had sunk beneath the skin. And yet, her skin did not have the stiffness he associated with frostbite. It was pliant, soft, though there was a faint waxiness to it that made him think of preserved specimens in a jar. He studied her face again, taking in the fineness of her features. The high cheekbones, the delicate nose, the lashes that rested like dark strokes against her pale skin. There was no sign of injury, no bruise, no swelling. Whatever had brought her to this state was working from within, invisible to the naked eye. "I will need to examine her more thoroughly," Thornfield said, stepping back. He turned to Marsh, noting the man's posture, the kind of rigid stance that belongs to someone braced for bad news. "Perhaps you would wait in the sitting room. You are half frozen yourself, and Mrs. Collins will bring you tea. It will be easier for me to work without the crowding." Reluctance flickered across Marsh's face, but he nodded. "Very well, but call me at once if there is any change." As the door closed behind father and housekeeper, Thornfield allowed himself a moment to gather his thoughts. He had treated unconscious patients before. Men fallen into drunken stupors. Women fell by strokes. Laborers injured in accidents. But something about Evelyn Marsh's condition was different. Almost unplaceably so. She was cold, yes, but not with the urgency of someone freezing to death. Her color was pale, but the blueness at her lips was delicate, almost deliberate, if such a word could apply to physiology. He checked her pulse at the wrist. Weak, erratic, but there. He moved to her eyelids, gently lifting one with the tip of his finger. The pupils contracted sluggishly, then expanded again, but not in response to the lamplight. It was a strange, pulsing rhythm of their own. Thornfield frowned. He had seen sluggish pupils in head injuries and illness, but this was something else entirely. Then his eyes were caught by something that made his breath still for a fraction of a second. In the irises, a gray-blue hue at first glance. There was movement, not the tremor of an eye, tracking motion, but an actual shifting within the color itself, as though smoke were swirling beneath the surface of her gaze. He blinked hard, telling himself it must be the play of light from the lamp. But when he looked again, the subtle, liquid motion was still there. "Most unusual," he murmured under his breath. With the care of someone performing a ritual, he reached for his thermometer, one of the newer mercury models from Philadelphia, and slid it beneath her arm. When the reading appeared, his frown deepened. 95 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the normal 98.6, and yet she showed none of the signs you would expect from hypothermia. No shivering, no stiffness in the jaw or extremities. He moved methodically now, tapping just below her kneecaps with his percussion hammer. A faint reflex, but present. Her breathing, measured against his pocket watch, was slow, 8 breaths a minute, barely half the normal rate for a child her age. And still, her lips retained that faint, odd hue, as though something in her very blood was different. Blood. The thought came to him with a quiet insistence. It would be the surest way to see if the cause lay deeper than surface observation could reach. From his medical bag, he took a fine silver lancet. With a quick, practiced motion, he made a small incision in the pad of her index finger. What emerged was not the bright, vivid red he had expected, but something darker, richer, almost burgundy in shade. More than that, it flowed differently, slower, thicker, as though reluctant to part from her. He placed a drop on a clean glass slide, and then, to his astonishment, it moved, not spread, as any liquid might under gravity, but shifted, forming and reforming subtle, deliberate patterns. "Impossible," he whispered. For a moment, Dr. Thornfield simply stared at the droplet on the slide, unwilling to believe what his own eyes told him. His first instinct was to blame some outside factor. Perhaps a tremor in his hand had disturbed the fluid, or a draft from the ill-fitted window had stirred it. Yet as he held the slide perfectly still between his fingers, the movement persisted. It was not random, not the meandering of a fluid settling into grooves of glass, but something far more deliberate. The pattern seemed to shift with a kind of rhythm, not unlike the slow dance of a tide across the sand, pulling back and folding over itself again in endless cycles. His heart gave a strange, tight beat in his chest. This was absurd. Blood did not move without a force to push it. Once drawn from the body, it began to clot, to dry. Its motion ceased. This, however, behaved as though it still lived, as though it possessed some latent memory of movement and purpose. He could not stop himself. Setting the slide carefully onto the stage of his brass-sized microscope, he adjusted the focus, his breath unconsciously holding as the glass brought the droplet into magnified view. The sight that filled the circle of light was unlike anything he had ever seen in all his years of training and practice. He had examined countless samples of blood, both healthy and diseased, over the course of his career. He knew the familiar landscape well, the round, biconcave discs of the red corpuscles, the larger, paler white cells drifting among them, the tiny, irregular platelets scattered through the plasma. They formed a map of life itself, each part with its function, each visible under the lens as a discrete, knowable thing. But Evelyn Marsh's blood contained none of these familiar forms. The field of vision revealed a homogeneous, translucent substance. No islands, no floating structures, only movement. It swirled in intricate, overlapping patterns, twisting into spirals and arcs, then flowing apart again. At times the movement coalesced into fleeting shapes that reminded Thornfield of primitive marine organisms he had seen illustrated in the works of naturalists. Jellyfish bells, curling tendrils, the undulation of sea anemones swaying in unseen currents. But these shapes dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared, folding back into the fluid continuum, as though they were nothing more than passing thoughts in the mind of the droplet. He adjusted the fine focus, his fingers steady on the brass knobs, and watched the shifting patterns draw tighter, then loosen again, as if obeying some law or instinct he could neither name nor measure. It was impossible, of course. Or at least, it was impossible within the bounds of what medical science currently knew. He thought at once of Virchow's great principle, now the cornerstone of cellular pathology, omnis cellula e cellula. Every cell arises from another cell. The cell was the fundamental unit of all living things. And yet here before his eyes was life, if life it was, without any cells at all. His first slide could not be trusted. The possibility of contamination was too great. Reaching for the lancet again, he prepared a fresh slide, pricking the girl's finger once more with gentle precision. The dark fluid welled reluctantly, and again he placed a single drop upon the glass, careful to keep his movements smooth, controlled. No vibration, no disturbance. He slid the fresh sample beneath the microscope and leaned in. The sight was the same currents, the same impossible, ceaseless motion. A ripple of something between exhilaration and dread ran through him. In his training, such a discovery would have been cause for immediate documentation, for presentation to one's peers. But here, in this quiet room with the snow pressing against the windows and the girl lying motionless on the table, the weight of the discovery felt heavier. Not a triumph, but a threshold. He straightened, rubbing at his eyes as though that might restore some familiar order to the world. Yet when he looked again, the patterns persisted, flowed with that same strange grace, heedless of his disbelief. On the table, Evelyn lay as she had since she arrived, her chest rising and falling in shallow, measured breaths. There was no flicker of awareness in her features, no sign that she felt the small intrusion to lancet. Thornfield found himself studying her face with new intensity, as though the secret written in her blood must somehow be echoed in the lines of her brow, the curve of her mouth. Was this a congenital defect, some rare, hitherto unrecorded condition? Or was it the mark of a disease so strange it had eluded identification entirely? Could such blood even carry oxygen? Could it fight infection? The practical questions jostled in his mind alongside others that were far less comfortable. He turned to his desk and began making notes in his leather-bound journal. His pen scratched over the paper, recording every observable detail. The unusual color and viscosity, the autonomous motion, the absence of cellular structures. He sketched the patterns as best he could, though the pen could only capture a poor approximation of their living complexity. In the margin, almost without thinking, he wrote 2 words, not human. The phrase startled him when he saw it there, stark in black ink. Not human. What had possessed him to write such a thing? It was unscientific, premature, and yet the thought had come unbidden, as a whisper from some quiet corner of his mind. A gust of wind rattled the windows, breaking his concentration. The snow was still falling, the light outside dimming, as afternoon waned into the gray-blue shadow of early evening. He glanced back at the girl, reassured himself that her pulse still fluttered faintly at her throat, and set down his pen. In all his years of study, James Thornfield had sought anomalies for the knowledge they could yield, small deviations from the expected that might open the door to greater understanding. But this was no small deviation. This was something that lay entirely outside the map of known physiology, a country unmarked by any of the charts and compasses of his profession. He found himself wondering, not for the last time, if he was the first to see it, or if others had looked upon the same strange currents and, for reasons of their own, had chosen silence. The wind outside had eased somewhat by the time Dr. Thornfield heard the slow creak of the sitting-room door and saw Edward Marsh step back into the surgery. The man's face was still pale from the cold, but there was a new sharpness to his eyes, an alertness that suggested he had been pacing, listening for any sound from within. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his boots leaving small wet crescents on the floor. "Well," Marsh's voice was low but tight, the question compressed into that single word as if he feared the answer. Thornfield hesitated. His instinct was to tell the man exactly what he had seen under the microscope, but some part of him recoiled from the idea of speaking aloud. Not because he doubted his observation, but because he could not yet frame it in any terms that would make sense outside his own mind. "Her pulse is weak but steady," he said instead. "Her breathing remains shallow. She is not in immediate danger of death, but her condition is unusual. I will need to keep her under observation for the time being." "Unusual how?" Thornfield kept his expression neutral. "Certain aspects of her state do not align with any illness I have treated before. But there is no fever, no sign of injury. That is encouraging." Marsh's jaw tightened. He glanced at his daughter, then looked away again, as though the sight of her lying there so still was more than he could bear. "This isn't the first time," he said finally. The admission caught Thornfield's attention. "Not the first time she has fallen into such a state?" Marsh nodded, the movement stiff. "The first was when she was 7. We were in Maine, visiting my late wife's family. She was playing in the garden one afternoon, perfectly well, and then she collapsed. No warning, no cry. We thought she had fainted, but she would not wake. We called for the local physician, an old man with more superstition than sense. He kept her in his care for nearly a fortnight. She lay just as you see her now, eyes closed, breathing barely there. Then, one morning, she simply woke, as if nothing had happened. How many times has this occurred?" Thornfield asked, though he could already feel the answer would unsettle him. 4. Marsh's gaze was fixed now on the girl, his voice flat with the effort of speaking. "Each time it is the same. She falls into this sleep. It lasts days, sometimes weeks. And when she wakes, she remembers nothing." Thornfield felt a slow, deliberate chill move through him, a sensation entirely different from the draft in the room. "And the doctors in Boston? What do they say?" "They disagree. Some think it a form of catalepsy. Others speak of disorders of the blood. One, a certain Dr. Whitmore, suggested it might be a kind of trance brought on by the mind itself, though he could not explain why it should strike at such long and irregular intervals. None could cure her. None could even explain the cause to my satisfaction." As Marsh spoke, Thornfield could feel the shape of the mystery tightening around him. The strange blood under his microscope was no isolated anomaly. It was part of something much larger, something that had shadowed this girl's life from her earliest years. Before he could frame another question, there came a sound from the table. It was not a groan, not even a sigh, but the faint, sharp inhale of a breath drawn with suddenness, as though someone had risen from deep water. Both men turned at once. Evelyn's eyelids had fluttered, then parted slightly. The gray blue of her irises glimmered faintly in the lamplight, and for a moment Thornfield thought he saw that same elusive swirl he had witnessed under the lens, a delicate motion within the color, gone almost before he could register it. Her gaze moved without focus, sliding past her father, past the doctor, as if the room were unfamiliar to her. "Evelyn," Marsh said quickly, stepping to her side. "It's father. You're safe." Her lips parted, and a sound emerged, dry, fragile, like paper brushed across stone. Thornfield leaned closer, straining to catch it, but the syllables were indistinct, swallowed by the effort it took her to form them. He poured a small measure of water into a cup and held it to her lips. She swallowed once, twice, her throat working painfully. When she spoke again, the words were clear, though faint. "It's cold." Thornfield exchanged a glance with Marsh. "Do you mean the room?" But Evelyn did not answer. Her gaze had shifted toward the far wall, though there was nothing there but the dark outline of the bookcase. Her pupils narrowed slightly, as if in reaction to something unseen. "What is it, my dear?" Marsh pressed, her brow furrowed, a faint crease appearing between her eyes. Then, with a slow exhalation, her lids sank close again. The hand that lay on the blanket twitched once, then was still. Her breathing returned to its shallow rhythm. "She's gone again," Marsh whispered, his voice carrying a note of despair so raw it seemed almost too private for the room to hold. Thornfield placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "It is not uncommon in certain states of illness for consciousness to come and go. The fact that she woke at all is a promising sign. It means there is still strength within her to be reached." But as he turned back to his desk, Thornfield could not shake the image of her eyes in that brief moment of waking. The swirling motion within the irises, subtle and deliberate, like the shifting of her blood under the glass. And he found himself wondering if her father's account of her memory loss was truly complete, or there were things Evelyn had seen during these spells that she could not, or would not, speak of. By late afternoon, the storm had deepened. The windows filmed over with frost, so thick it seemed to mute even the lamplight inside. Outside, the street of Blackwood was an indistinct blur beneath the white fury, the outlines of buildings reduced to shadowed shapes beneath snow-laden eaves. Travel was impossible. Thornfield knew they would all be confined here until morning, perhaps longer. He instructed Mrs. Collins to prepare the upstairs guest room for Marsh, but he insisted Evelyn remain in the surgery where he could keep her under constant observation. A bed was made up for her against the wall. The linens warmed at the hearth before she was moved. The small iron stove in the corner was stoked until the air shimmered faintly with heat, though even so Thornfield could feel the cold that seemed to cling to her body, as though it were its own climate, immune to the fire's reach. As evening descended, Marsh sat beside his daughter's bed, the posture of a sentinel who would not be relieved. He refused food until Thornfield pressed a plate into his hands and insisted. Even then, the man ate mechanically, his gaze returning to her every few moments as though fearing she might vanish in the time it took to chew. When the last light had faded from the world beyond the frost-covered panes, Thornfield lit a final lamp and seated himself at his desk with his journal. He wrote in a precise, deliberate hand, noting her pulse, temperature, and the brief moment of waking that afternoon. Yet it was his private observations, committed to the margin in smaller script, that carried the weight of his unease. Cold persists despite ambient warmth. Coloration unchanged. Breathing shallow, rhythmic. Pupillary motion unresponsive to light. Possible autonomous activity? He paused over the next line, then added, swirling patterns in iris appear analogous to movement observed in blood under magnification. At midnight, Mrs. Collins brought a pot of tea, her steps hushed as though they stood in a chapel. "You should rest a little, doctor," she murmured. "You've been on your feet since morning." "I will," he lied. Marsh retired reluctantly an hour later, leaving Thornfield alone with the girl and the sound of the wind outside. He settled into the chair beside her bed, the steady tick of the clock on the wall measuring the long moments between each shallow breath she drew. It was in those quiet hours that the first odd thing happened. He had been gazing into the fire, allowing his mind to wander to the maze of possible diagnoses, when a faint shift in the air drew his attention back to her. At first he thought it was only the flicker of the lamplight on her face, but then he saw her lips moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. No sound emerged, just the barest shaping of words that could not be heard. Thornfield leaned forward, straining to catch even a whisper. The pattern of her lips did not seem random. They moved in repetition, as though forming the same phrase again and again. He reached for a scrap of paper and tried to follow the shape of each syllable. It looked like the river. He sat back, pulse quickening. The phrase meant nothing to him in this context, but the fact that she was forming words in her unconscious state was extraordinary. Marsh had claimed she lay insensible during these episodes, unaware of her surroundings. Yet here she was, speaking, if only to some place her mind still wandered. The second oddity came soon after. A pale gleam caught his eye, and for a moment he thought frost had formed on the cuff of her sleeve. But as he bent closer, he saw it was not frost at all. It was her skin. The faint bluish cast at her lips now traced delicately along the veins at her wrist and forearm, as though the strange hue within her blood was rising closer to the surface. It shimmered faintly, like light glancing off the scales of a fish beneath water. Thornfield's fingers hovered just above her arm, unwilling to touch until he understood what he was seeing. Slowly, the hue faded, the shimmer vanishing as though it had never been there. The clock struck 2. He told himself fatigue was preying on his senses, that the mind, deprived of sleep, could invent almost anything from the interplay of shadow and lamplight. And yet he could not shake the image, the strange, subtle glow pulsing in time with her heartbeat. An hour later, the third and most unsettling event occurred. He had risen to tend the stove when he heard movement, not the rustle of blankets or the shifting of limbs, but the distinct sound of someone standing. He turned sharply. Evelyn was upright beside the bed, her bare feet pale against the floorboards, her nightgown trailing like a wisp of smoke. Miss Marsh. His voice was measured calm, though every instinct urged caution. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the frost-glazed window, and in the lamplight her irises seemed almost luminous. Slowly, she raised her right hand and pressed her palm flat to the glass. "You should lie down," Thornfield said softly, taking a step toward her. Her lips moved again, forming that same phrase. The river. Then, with deliberate care, she turned her head toward him. For the first time, her eyes met his fully, and in them he saw the unmistakable swirl, the shifting currents he had observed through the microscope, alive and moving within her gaze. Before he could speak, her knees gave way. He caught her just before she struck the floor, the sudden cold of her body biting into his arms. Gently, he laid her back on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady. She did not wake. Thornfield stood for a long moment, staring at the frost-silvered window and the faint print of her hand upon it. He could not have said why, but a part of him knew with absolute certainty that the words she had mouthed were not random, and that whatever the river was, it lay at the center of this mystery. Dawn arrived grudgingly, a colorless seep of light behind the snow-thick sky that did little more than turn the frost on the panes from silver to ash. The storm had slackened, but Blackwood remained muffled and unmoving, the street outside a buried ribbon between mounded walls. Thornfield had dozed in the chair for scarcely half an hour when the hallway boards creaked and Edward Marsh appeared, hair disordered, cravat askew, the look of a man who had dreamed himself into wakefulness and found no relief there. He took in the scene at once. Evelyn asleep, the wool blanket drawn to her chin, the extra cold glow in the stove, and his gaze landed on the window, where a faint oval of her handprint still dulled the frost. "She was up," he said. Not a question. His voice had a hoarseness that spoke of a throat scraped by unspoken words. For a moment, Thornfield answered, rising with care so as not to disturb the girl. She stood, walked a window. "Sleepwalking, I think." He did not add what he had seen in her eyes, the tidal motion in the irises, as though saying it might call it forth again. "She formed words," he continued. Though no sound came, the phrase repeated. He paused. "It looked like the river." Marsh pressed his lips together, the muscles in his jaw tightening as if against pain. He turned away a fraction, as though aligning himself with an angle of the room that made bearing the truth possible. "I had prayed," he said at last, "that you would not hear that." He moved to the bedside and stood with his hands braced against the footboard, his head bowed. "It has been the same from the first time." "The first time in Maine?" Thornfield prompted gently. Marsh nodded. "Yes. The garden there sloped to a brook that ran to the sheepskin, and from there to the sea." She woke after 3 days and did not remember. But in her sleep she had spoken. My sister-in-law heard it first. She said it sounded like calling to someone, not in English. And then, over and over, the river, not in English. Thornfield repeated, "What language?" "I do not know," Marsh said, and the honesty in his tone carried a defeated relief. There were words I could not place, rounded, liquid, as if spoken through water. I asked the physicians. They shrugged and called it a trick of the ear, or the nonsense syllables of a distressed child. But the phrase, the river, he let out a breath that clouded faintly in the cold. That remained constant. We moved house soon after. It seemed, superstitious as it may sound, that the water drew her. In Boston, I took a place far from the harbor. The windows did not look upon it. I thought distance would weaken whatever pull there was. And did it? Thornfield asked. For a time. Marsh glanced toward the faint imprint on the window. But it returned. It always returned. Thornfield gestured to the chair and waited until Marsh sat. He poured coffee from the pot Mrs. Collins had set near the stove, and the steam rose thin and fragrant. For a few heartbeats they drank in silence, men measuring the weight of words before they were spoken. "Mr. Marsh," Thornfield said, keeping his voice even, "last night there are 3 things I must put on the record. First, her sleepwalking. Second, the formation of the phrase. Third," he hesitated. The memory of the shimmer along Evelyn's veins was vivid, insistent. Her skin took on a faint hue along the vessels, bluish, luminous for a moment. It passed. "But I must ask, have you ever noticed a similar change?" Marsh's eyes closed as if against bright light. "Yes," he said, "twice. Once 2 winters past. Once," he cleared his throat, "once the week before we left Boston for New York. It is faint. And if I had not been watching her so closely, I might have dismissed it." He set the cup down with care. "Doctor, you must understand that I am no fool. I own factories. Balance sheets and contracts are the languages I speak best. I am not a credulous man." And yet he lifted his hands, studying the tremor that had taken them. "And yet there are things for which I have no vocabulary. My late wife had an attachment to the sea. It was not a pastime. It was—" He searched the air for a word and failed. "A need. She walked ashore in winter without shawl or gloves, and said she could not feel the cold there. I thought it the dramatics of a sensitive woman. But on the night Evelyn was born, Charlotte's skin grew chill as if the fire had been carried out of her in the child's first cry. She spoke of going back, and I thought it was delirium." He swallowed. "I have thought many things since." Thornfield set his cup aside and leaned forward, forearms on his knees. The lamplight warmed the brass of his ice, and in its gleam he saw a miniature of his own face, drawn, thin by the long night. "You mentioned the New York physician, Dr. Winfield." He let the name hang a moment. "What did he say in private?" Marsh's gaze lifted sharply, the look of a man who had concealed a shard and now felt it turn beneath the skin. He examined the sample. He said, "He was courteous to Evelyn, brisk with me. He told me the iron would do no harm, and that we must avoid agitation. Outside consultation room. Alone, he spoke differently. He said there was anomalous activity in her blood under the lens. He would not name it, only that it did not conform to the structures he expected. I asked if it could be disease. He said he had no category for it." Marsh's mouth twisted, a laugh that had no humor in it. "No category. As if the absence of a word might shelter us." Thornfield kept his tone neutral, though his pulse quickened. It matched too closely what he himself had seen. "Did he advise you to conceal this?" he asked. "He advised me to keep my daughter from the eyes of the curious," Marsh said. "He said unusual cases have a way of drawing not only physicians but showmen, that there are cabinets in this country where wonders are displayed for a price, and he would not have Evelyn among them." His hand closed into a fist on his knee, as if I needed telling. Outside, a drift slipped from the eave with a soft, dragging sound. Somewhere in the house a pipe ticked as the stove's heat traveled. Evelyn's breathing remained shallow, even. The imprint on the window had begun to fade as the frost reclaimed its territory. Thornfield watched it dim. and felt a twinge of urgency that he did not immediately name. The world, he thought, erased what did not belong as swiftly as ice took back glass. "There is more," Marsh said, voice lower. "Things I have not told the other physicians, because they looked at me as if I were lost of reason." His eyes went to his daughter's hands beneath the blanket, to the slimness of the fingers. "I have found her sitting before a bowl of salted water for hours, unmoving. I have heard her speak in her sleep, in that same liquid tongue you asked after. I have seen," he hesitated, then forced it out, "I have seen patches on her back, like the finest scales. They come and go. If I touch them, they lift away, no mark beneath, as if the skin discards them once they have done their work. Tell me, doctor, what am I to do with that in a ledger of symptoms?" Thornfield did not answer at once. The impulse to reassure, to offer a name, a regimen, a list of steps, rose in him, the habit of physician trained to sound decisive for the sake of those who clung to his words. But he could not trade false certainty for comfort. "You are to do," he said slowly, "what you've been doing. Keep her warm. Keep her watched. Tell me everything, even if it seems mad. I will record it and test what can be tested." He drew a breath, then let honesty come. "And you will accept that there may be no category yet for what your daughter is. That does not mean there is no truth to it." Marsh's shoulders eased, as if the confession had uncoiled a wire drawn too tight. "You do not think me raving." "I think you a father," Thornfield said, "and I think there are mysteries that do not diminish under a lens, only rearrange themselves." Marsh looked at him a long moment. "You said she spoke the phrase last night," he murmured. "The river." He turned the words in his mouth, as if tasting them for bitterness. "There is one more thing you should know. Before Boston, before Maine, when Charlotte and I were newlywed, we lived in Salem. Our house stood above an inlet that filled on the tide. One night, very late, I woke and found Charlotte standing at the open window, no shawl, no slippers, breathing that bitter air as if it fed her. She said she could hear them calling. I asked who. She would not say, but I have wondered, again and again, if the river is not a place only." He glanced toward the fading handprint. "If it is a road." "A road," Thornfield repeated softly. "Downstream." "To the sea," Marsh said. He scrubbed a hand over his face, as if to wipe sleep from a day that had not granted it. "I brought her inland to save her. God help me if I have only made the path harder to walk." A soft sound drew them both, Evelyn's lashes fluttering like moth wings against snowlight. Her lips formed a shape too small to hear. Thornfield bent close. The word rose without sound, but he knew it now without reading. River. Then her mouth shaped a second word he had not seen before, a rounded syllable that might have been a name, or water given a voice. It curled and was gone. Thornfield straightened. "Mr. Marsh," he said, brisk now because action was the only defense against wonder, "I will take another sample this morning. I want to see if the patterns in her blood change with the day. After that, we will try a mild stimulant to the senses. Ammonia again, perhaps camphor, nothing violent. And I would ask one more indulgence." He nodded toward the window. "When the road clears, I want to walk the river." Marsh's eyes flicked to the glass and back. He nodded once, the motion sharp, as if agreement itself were an act of will. "If there is a road," he said, "we had better learn where it goes." Evelyn slept on. Outside, the gray morning deepened, and somewhere beneath the snow the Blackwood River continued its patient work, indifferent to human roofs and rooms above it, bearing its burden toward the waiting sea. The storm broke sometime in the late morning, leaving behind a sky the color of unpolished pewter and a world remade in white. Snow lay heavy across the roofs of Blackwood, curling over eaves and weighing down the bare limbs of the oaks. The silence was so complete that even the occasional creak of ice in the trees seemed to fall into it with reverence. Thornfield, having drawn another sample from Evelyn's arm just after dawn, stood at the surgery's front window and watched the townsfolk begin the slow work of clearing narrow paths between door and street. In the stillness, the faint gurgle of water moving somewhere beneath the drifts made him turn his head toward the river's unseen course. Evelyn had not stirred again since the small motion of her lips at dawn. Her pulse was steady, the cold in her skin unchanged. Thornfield had placed a fresh slide beneath the Zeiss lens, while the light was still angled enough to illuminate it. The patterns within her blood were not static. They swirled faintly, slow as silt settling in water, and each turn of the movement seemed to repeat as though governed by some internal tide. He had timed the rotation at intervals, finding it almost matched the rhythm of a heartbeat but with the faintest lag, as if following another pulse altogether. Marsh entered from the back, boots damp, bringing with him the smell of snow and iron. "The road toward the river bridge is passable for a few hundred yards," he said. "After that, the drifts are chest-high." He glanced at his daughter. "If you mean to walk it, you'll need a pole and a mine for where the ice crust is weakest." "I mean to walk it," Thornfield said, and though he kept his voice mild, he felt the weight of his own urgency. "I want to see the course firsthand." Marsh hesitated. "You think it has something to do with her?" "I think it is the one thing she has named," Thornfield answered. "That makes it a place of interest." He reached for his coat. "I will not be long." Mrs. Collins appeared from the kitchen with a wool scarf in her hands. "You'll be long enough to take frost in your bones if you go alone, Doctor." She looped the scarf around his neck herself, as if warding off not just the cold, but whatever he might find beyond the door. "Mind the bend by the Miller barn. There's a sinkhole under the snow where the bank gives way." Outside, the cold gripped him instantly, the kind that stole the breath before it left his throat. The snow underfoot was brittle in places, hollow in others, and he moved with the care of a man reading the ground as much as walking it. The sun was a muted disk behind thin cloud, lending no warmth, but its angles sent pale glints racing over the drifted surface, like light refracted through shallow water. The river revealed itself gradually, first as a depression where the snow sagged, then as a dark seam cutting through the white. At its narrowest, it ran swift and black, untroubled by the winter ice except at the edges, where frail shelves clung to the banks. The sound of it was subtle but insistent, a low and constant voice threading through the still air. Thornfield stood on the bank for a long moment, watching the current slip past. The water was unervingly clear, and here and there he could see shapes, stones, weeds, the pale ghost of a branch, shifting slightly in the pull. He moved downstream to where the current widened into a slow bend. The bank was steep here, the snow crust thin. Kneeling carefully, he reached down with a gloved hand to break a piece of ice at the margin. The water beneath was shockingly cold. Yet the clarity held, and something in the greenish hue of its depths called to mind the strange tint he had seen in Evelyn's veins. A flicker in his peripheral vision made him glance upstream. For a moment, he thought a figure stood on the opposite bank, tall, motionless. He blinked against the brightness and found the space empty. Only the black thread of the river and the white expanse beyond remained. Yet as he rose, brushing snow from his knee, a faint impression lingered in his mind, that whoever had been there, if anyone, had been watching the same water with the same intent. The walk back was slower, his thoughts dragging with the weight of unanswered questions. He replayed the movement in her blood beneath the lens, the phrase formed by her lips, the shimmer along her arm. None of it was consistent with any pathology he knew. Yet taken together, they suggested a pattern, one not bound to confines of the body but tethered to something beyond it. When he returned, Mrs. Collins was tending the stove, and Marsh stood by the window, gazing out toward the white glare beyond the street. Evelyn lay as before, yet her hand, resting atop the blanket, was damp. Thornfield took it gently. The moisture was faint but unmistakable, not sweat, but something cooler, like the sheen left by mist or spray. "She has not moved," Marsh said quickly, as if to deny any possibility of another nocturnal wandering. "I've been here the whole time." "Then it is ambient," Thornfield murmured, more to himself than to Marsh. He released her hand, the coolness already fading. Marsh looked at him with a shadow of apprehension. "And what does that mean, Doctor?" "That," Thornfield said, "is what I mean to find out. But it suggests the river is not a place she goes. It is a place that comes to her." The words hung between them like a draft from an open door. Thornfield turned toward his desk and began setting up the Zeiss for another examination, his mind already arranging the morning's observations into a ledger of evidence. Somewhere in the quiet house, a single drop of melted snow tapped against the sill, as if marking the time between questions. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted toward that muted gold that winter sometimes permitted, a fragile illumination that seemed borrowed rather than owned. Thornfield set the second slide beneath his ice, adjusting the brass arm with care. Marsh stood behind him, silent but taut with the kind of patience born of necessity, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles blanched. Thornfield focused, then stilled. The structures in the sample were no longer content with slow, circular drift. They undulated now, curling and stretching like threads drawn by a tide. The motion was not random. It carried a directional pull, always to the right of the field, so consistent that Thornfield found himself glancing toward the window, toward the river's course beyond the street. He adjusted the lens, watched again. At intervals, the shapes seemed to merge, forming narrow strands that shimmered faintly before separating. He had seen such unity only in certain colonial organisms, a cooperation rather than competition, as if the elements of her blood were not fighting but answering the same call. When he straightened, Marsh was watching his face. "Well, it is changing," Thornfield said, "and it is not decay. It is alignment." Marsh's brow furrowed. "With what?" "That," Thornfield said, "I cannot name, but it is drawing towards something beyond her body." He let out a breath. "This morning I walked the river. I cannot prove the connection, but I believe it is there." Marsh's eyes darkened, the kind of darkness that was less shadow than deep water. "I feared that." Before Thornfield could reply, the sound of approaching steps on the porch cut through the quiet. A knock followed, a measured, deliberate rhythm. Mrs. Collins, wiping her hands, went to the door. A man stood framed in the pale light outside. His coat was heavy with frost, and the brim of his hat shadowed eyes the color of sea glass. "I'm looking for Edward Marsh," he said, his voice low and certain. Marsh came forward, the stiffness in his gait betraying surprise. "I am Marsh. And you are—" The man removed his hat. His hair was the iron gray of a storm horizon, his face weathered, the lines deep but not unkind. "Daniel Cutter. I knew your wife, and I know what calls your daughter." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Thornfield watched Marsh's expression shudder, the way a man might bar a door before the wind could enter. "You've come far to say too much," Marsh said. "I've come far to keep you from losing her," Cutter replied. "Charlotte came from a line that belonged to the water long before she belonged to you. Your daughter is not sick. She's unfinished." Marsh's jaw tightened. "You will not speak riddles about my child." "It isn't a riddle," Cutter said softly. "It's a choice. You can keep her inland, keep her waking in cold sweats, keep her blood turning toward what it cannot reach. Or you can take her to the mouth of the river and let her decide if she wants the rest of what she is." Thornfield glanced between them. What would that mean for her? Cutter's gaze met his, steady and unreadable. It would mean the current stops pulling, one way or the other. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint tick of cooling metal in the stove. Then Marsh shook his head. "You asked me to risk losing her forever. I asked you to stop losing her a little each day," Cutter said. He set his hat back on his head. "The thaw will come early this year. If you change your mind, follow the river until you taste the salt in the air. She will know the rest." He left without waiting for an answer, his boots crunching away into the snowbound street, until the sound dissolved into the quiet. Marsh stood motionless, his face unreadable, then turned toward the bed. Evelyn lay as she had for hours, but her fingers twitched faintly against the blanket. As if in dream, she traced the shape of flowing water. Thornfield spoke at last. "You know I cannot tell you what is right, only what may be." Marsh's eyes did not leave his daughter. "No," he said almost to himself, "only what may be." Outside, the sky lowered again, promising another snow. The river, unseen, moved on beneath its cover of ice, patient and ceaseless, carrying whatever it carried toward the place where fresh water meets the salt. And in the quiet of the surgery, the rhythm of Evelyn Marsh's pulse matched the pull of that unseen current. Not in weakness, but in waiting. This ending keeps the mystery intact, gives the father a choice without resolution, and ties the imagery of the river back to beginning for thematic closure.